Hello everyone, and welcome to the Compassionate Cowgirl Show, where I teach you how to connect with your horse using compassion, innovation, and self-awareness. And today we are going to talk about trauma in horses. How do we prevent trauma? Now, we are going to have a camper talk today. I'll show you guys my new camper that I'm living in now, but we're going to have a camper talk. And we're going to go inside and talk about one of my biggest inspirations for helping to prevent and resolve trauma in horses. And that inspiration is someone named Dr. Peter Levine, who developed the Somatic Experiencing technique. And specifically, his book, Waking the Tiger, has been a huge inspiration for me. We'll also talk about his newer book. I'm going to read you guys some quotes, and then we'll talk about bring them back to the human-horse connection and how they relate there, and how we can take his discoveries and apply it to the connection we have with our horses. So let's go ahead and head into the camper and get started. Now, before we dive in, it's important before we get started to understand what a horse's reactions are to fear. So a horse is going to go into fight, flight, or freeze in their reaction to fear. Now, the horses, being herd animals, are, in their survival, depending on how they get along with each other, are really quite peaceful by nature. And they do prefer, most of the time, to go into flight when they are under a high state of arousal. So the horse is just going to try to get away. They're going to bolt. They're going to be just all tense and jiggy, and they're just constantly moving. It's this flight reaction. Now, fight would be a buck, a kick, charging, striking, biting, things like that. And typically, I see this when flight is denied. Because again, horses are quite peaceful by nature, and this can be different for some horses. Some horses are more likely to go into fight than others. And then finally, freeze is the third reaction. So freeze is this immobility response. We'll see that Peter, Dr. Levine, he talks about it, and he calls it tonic immobility. So freeze is most oftentimes, it is when flight is denied, or fight. So the horse feels like they don't have any other options. They can't escape. They can't fight back. They're going to freeze and they're going to shut down. And we'll see that is the least recognized, I would say, especially in the horse industry, but also the most dangerous, because once the horse goes into a state of freeze, that's a lot of times when PTSD is going to occur, and trauma is going to stay in the body. And we don't see this with wild animals as much because they are not restrained. When horses come into our care, they're restrained. We have ropes, we have pens, we have things like that are going to restrain the animal. So that's why we don't see PTSD in wild animals, but we see it in horses under human care, and animals under human care. So that's important before we get started. So let's go ahead and dive in now. What is trauma exactly? So this is how Dr. Levine describes trauma. My observations of scores of traumatized people has led me to conclude that post-traumatic symptoms are fundamentally incomplete physiological responses suspended in fear. Reactions to life-threatening situations remain symptomatic until they are completed. Post-traumatic stress is one example. These symptoms will not go away until the responses are discharged and completed. Energy held in immobility can be transformed, as we have seen. So basically, when we have this high state of arousal and fight or flight, is denied, and exit is denied, and we go into the immobility response, we go into that response with a lot of energy. And if it's not discharged, that's when trauma can occur. So he also outlines the fear and immobility cycle. So you see this state of arousal followed by an unsuccessful escape. So in the horse world, that would mean that the horse experiences a high state of arousal, they're way over threshold, and they are not able to get away. So they're contained by a small pen, by a rope of some sort. So then the experience of fear and helplessness follows, followed by immobilization, that freeze reaction, also called tonic immobility. And then they just stay in this loop where they're constantly just kind of in this state of arousal. The 2 ingredients required for trauma to occur. Potentially traumatic situations are ones that induce states of high physiological arousal, but without the freedom for the affected person to express and get past these states. Danger without the possibility of fight or flight, and afterward without the opportunity to shake it off as a wild animal would following a frightful encounter with a predator. The 2 ingredients he's talking about here that put an animal or person at more risk for experiencing trauma are a high state of arousal combined with the inability to get away, the inability to flee or go into fight or flight. That means that if the animal is denied fight or flight, which horses being, usually very peaceful animals, herd animals, they're going to choose to go into flight. When that flight instinct is denied, they go into freeze, which is the 3rd reaction state, which he calls tonic immobility, the paralysis and physical, emotional shutdown that characterize the universal experience of helplessness in the face of mortal danger. So once horses go into freeze, which again is caused by denying them flight, if they're under a high state of arousal, that's when the trauma can occur and stay in the body. And one more time to solidify the ingredients of trauma. To summarize, it is my observation that a precondition for the development of post-traumatic stress disorder is that a person is both frightened and perceives that he or she is trapped. The interaction of intense fear and immobility is fundamental in the formation of trauma, and its maintenance and its deconstruction, resolution, and transformation. So again, these 2 ingredients required to induce trauma in people as well as animals that are in human care. The perception of no escape possible. Trauma occurs when we are intensely frightened and are either physically restrained or perceive that we are trapped. We freeze in paralysis and or collapse in overwhelming helplessness. So this is again going back to the 2 ingredients for trauma to occur: when we're intensely frightened, that high state of arousal, and the perceived inability to get away, the perceived the perception that we are trapped in some way, just like with the horses, if they are contained with a rope or a small pin, etc. It's the perception, I think, that's really important, because I think we could also make the argument, well, horses are much stronger. They could try, they could pull that rope away if they really wanted to. But it really goes back to the perception of not being able to get away. So if they're really conditioned to not fight the pressure of the lead rope, then, it's still going to be the horse is trapped. Now, another component I want to talk about this is also relating this perception of the inability to flee to human trauma as well. So this is a really good quote here. It should be no surprise, given the nature of fear-induced immobility, that a majority of rape victims predictably describe feeling paralyzed and unable to move. Being held down and terrorized by someone much larger, stronger, and heavier is virtually guaranteed to induce long-lasting immobility and thus trauma. Rape not only forces one to keep still, it induces an inner immobility because of the terror, fear-potentiated immobility. In one study, 88% of the victims of childhood assault and 75% of the victims of adult sexual assault reported moderate to high levels of paralysis during the assault. In addition, because of the high levels of dissociation, it is likely that many victims do not remember feeling paralyzed or deny the paralysis because they feel so guilty for not having fought back. That to me is so big, the way that we can really shame and punish ourselves for not fighting back when this is a physiological reaction, right, that we don't necessarily have control over. He goes on to write, similarly, soldiers under fire can rarely flee or even physically fight. They must frequently stay pinned close to the ground, resisting both active fight and flight urges while calmly trying to steady aim and fire their guns. So this story speaks to modern cultures that tend to judge immobilization and dissociation in the face of overwhelming threat as a weakness tantamount to cowardice. Beneath this castigating judgment lies a pervasive fear of feeling trapped and helpless. This fear and helplessness of feeling trapped can come to dominate a person's life in the form of persistent and debilitating shame. Together, shame and trauma form a particularly violent and interlocked combination. Self-blame and self-hatred are common among molestation and rape survivors who judge themselves harshly for not putting up a fight, even where fight was not a viable solution or survival option. So this is just, packed with great information if you guys are interested. But it's so interesting to take the parallels between how trauma is developed, whether it's a person or an animal. And Dr. Levine does an amazing job of that. And I think that his work has been such a huge inspiration for me with the horses, with especially for developing a process for gentling wild horses and starting colts and wild horses in a way that doesn't induce trauma, and also rehabilitating horses who have held on to quite a bit of trauma. Avoiding a high state of arousal through titration. Okay, here's another quote. As I discovered, it was crucial to titrate, gradually access these psychological reactions so that they were not overwhelming. Just exposing a client to his or her traumatic memories and having the person relieve them was at best unnecessary, reducing integration and feelings of mastery and goodness, and at worst, re-traumatizing for the individual. So this is so important, and this titration I talk about in the 5 Golden Rules to the Horse-Human Connection course, but it's a chemistry term where you put like 1 drop of a chemical into another chemical in your test tube, right, and drop by drop so that you can see the exact drop where the chemical changes. Maybe it changes color, etc. So you're gradually adding this new chemical, just like with a horse. You would gradually add a stimulus in these small approximations. You're shaping the behavior, breaking it down into these small steps, so that you can also see what causes the reaction, so that you can then take that as feedback and say, okay, is it the sound of the tarp? Let's reduce that then to build your confidence. Or is it the feeling of the tarp? Is it the size of the tarp? Okay, let's roll it up a little bit, make it smaller, and work where you're comfortable. So that's another key in preventing trauma or resolving it, is to really break things down into little steps. And I see this a lot with horses, us just asking for too much and sending the horse kind of over their threshold, or their window of tolerance for how much pressure or how much of this novel stimulus that they can take before going into a reaction. So again, I talk about that much more in the 5 Golden Rules to the Horse-Human Connection course if you guys are interested in really diving deep into that. But my inspiration for this has been through trauma research. Prevention tips for avoiding trauma. So after looking over Dr. Levine's book and going over those quotes and applying it to the horse-human relationship, I just want to reiterate the 2 ways that trauma forms and how to prevent those with horses. So the ingredients for trauma, remember, are A, high state of arousal, and B, the inability to escape. So what that means is that we can prevent trauma in our horses, whether you're using negative or positive reinforcement techniques, the pressure and release or the clicker training. Prevention tip number 1, allowing the horse to say no. You can prevent trauma by always giving the horse the ability to say no in some way. that looks maybe a little bit different with positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement, but if you're using negative reinforcement, the ability to say no would be allowing the horse to move out and renegotiate their reaction, in the sense that they can move out into flight. Their flight is not denied, and then they can renegotiate the reaction and realize that they didn't really need to go into flight, that it wasn't a true threat. The horse saying no in positive reinforcement training is simply them missing out on the chance to get the click and treat for that, and then moving on to another behavior, building up that behavioral momentum, and then revisiting the tricky behavior. For more on implementing these strategies and applying them, you can check out my Academy membership, where I have several online videos of how to allow your horse to say no. And another great resource, if you want to go really in depth, is the 5 Golden Rules course, the 5 Golden Rules to the Horse-Human Connection. And I walk you through how to give your horse a chance to say no using both positive and negative reinforcement techniques. Prevention tip number 2, avoid a high state of arousal by honoring thresholds. Now, the other component of preventing trauma is avoiding the high state of arousal. So that means working within the horse's threshold, working at a level where the horse is not highly stressed. And we do that by the process of titration or shaping, okay, which is rule number 3 of my 5 golden rules. Is breaking the behavior down into these small components, one step at a time, one drop at a time, just like the process of titration in chemistry, so that you're not just throwing it all at the horse. You're working under threshold, under a reaction, where the horse is able to be learning. That is also a crucial component. So the 2 ingredients of trauma and how to avoid trauma in our horses, that is a summary that wraps this all up for you. I hope that this made sense to you. I hope that you'll share the word. So if this episode resonated for you, or you think someone you know would benefit from listening, please feel free to share. I would love your help in getting this message out. And also, if you don't want to miss an episode of the Compassionate Cowgirl, make sure that you hit subscribe and the little bell below so that you're notified when the next episode is released. And I will see you guys next Wednesday for another episode of the Mystic Experiment. I will see you guys soon. Have a great rest of your day.